Okay, yeah. I am Amber Thompson. I have an appointment right now at the University of Utah, both in the sociology department and the epidemiology department. But I also want to echo Amy's thanks for all of you showing up for this group, putting the symposium together, just for having a space to be able to share, similar interests and really talk openly about some of these tensions and some of the issues, right, that are coming up that deserve recognition in order for us to move forward. Frances, and I forget her first name, but her quote always stuck with me as it's really important to be a loyal critic, right? I want to see this advance so much. And so I think that's our duty is to, face some of these challenges head on, to make sure that we are identifying them and addressing them. But to give you a little bit more background about me, kind of give you context of where I'm coming from. So I am trained as a sociologist, and I have studied the medical institution through just a variety of lenses. But what brought me to this realm, like very many of you, was through personal experience, right? It was during and after my dad's death, that I was really consumed with this thought of surely we can do better, right? Surely we can die better. Now, full disclosure, I absolutely was one who didn't recognize but did adhere to that medicalized view of end of life, right? That this was something that we handle in hospitals and it's overseen by doctors. In fact, we laugh sometimes about it now, right? It's been 11 years. And so I can look back and laugh now, but at the time, it was this vivid memory of when my dad said, I want out of the hospital, take me home. I don't want to die here. And I remember driving away from the hospital, just kind of aghast, just what are they letting us do? How in the world could they let us take him home? Who's gonna watch us? Like who's gonna make sure we're not doing something wrong? It kind of blew my mind. So my experience with my dad really forced me to ask those questions that I think bring a lot of us here of, what if we had talked about it more? Would it have been near as jarring as it was? Right? What would it have looked like if it was different, if it was a more natural and human event, right? Would it have fostered more of that support and care and connection rather than the, isolation and confusion that my family really was left sitting in? And as a researcher, as an academic, my natural instinct was I have to find out answers, right? There's nothing else to be done. I must go and search. I think Marion brought up a really good point, because she asked a couple of times, right? Why does this matter? And so that's always one of those questions that I try to go back to of why did it matter, right? Because my experience was not an outlier, right? This was not a unique experience that I had had. The reality is that dying, very often is medicalized, it's impersonal, and it's very lonely, right? Families are left with this gap in care. That's not to say that medical teams are not trying, to address some of this, and especially that they don't do their best when it comes to those physical needs. But we know, right? Very often they do not have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the training to be able to actually, guide families through the emotional, the spiritual, the relational aspects that come along with death. So I feel like a lot of people are still left with that question of who is handling, right? That human side of death. So obviously one of the answers that I ran into when I was, asking all of these hard questions was end of life doulas. And I read a lot of, right, descriptions that on the surface we would simply say, right, they're providing, practical and emotional support to dying individuals and their care networks during end of life. But when I really started delving into this, I really wanted to start arguing that they're more than just individual carers, that they are part of this larger cultural shift, right? A social movement, if you will, that is really changing how we are starting to approach death. So when I began to try to find out what I could in this area, the information was pretty limited, academic information, way more so. But I did learn, right, some of these basics that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but basics like they don't provide medical care, right? Their role is really that of presence, listening, helping explain, here's what to expect, um, guiding families through just one of the toughest transitions that can occur in life and really just holding that space for the really difficult emotions that come with this. Now, we've kind of talked about this, so we know that research was showing that as of now, end-of-life doulas are mostly women, often middle-aged, and very often with some connection to healthcare. I found out many of them see this as a calling, that some are volunteering, some are charging. There's a mixture of these two things, but that very few are actually making this like a main profession. In fact, as has been noted multiple times here, right, that tension within this movement is around that professionalization and regulation. Um, should it remain more volunteer based or should it be recognized and paid as a professional position? But even all of this information that I had started to learn, it still felt kind of very surface level, and I really wanted to dig deeper on a systems level. So I started where I felt like was, the first place that I could possibly start, which was where were end-of-life doulas coming from, right? I had learned some things like it's characterized by this kind of loosely formed organization or network, that there is some collective identity formation happening. There's some shared cultural contestation, but actually positioning it within that broader trajectory of healthcare reform hadn't really been investigated yet. So to do that, I went with origin stories, right? Which is basically this idea of we have to look at the past, right? What are the history, influences, experiences that this emerged within and continues to impact it as it evolves? Why that matters again, right? It helps us to explain the motivations and values, but it helps add a lot of depth and complexity to understanding this role and where it could possibly go. Which takes us to the third one, right? It provides us with a foundation of understanding any future developments that are coming. So as I'm learning, right, I'm absorbing it like a sponge as most as I can. I ran into this list on the right as different claims, right? Claims making that I'll talk about of where this actually came from, right? It was a return to roots. It's something we used to do that we didn't do anymore. Maybe it was a response to the modern medicalization. They were filling social care gaps, that it was a calling, and I'll add to that, I also heard in that same vein that it was a privilege, right? Both for those who were able to receive the service, but also a privilege in terms of someone being able to provide that type of service. I heard that it was simply just one small component, right, of this phenomenon of death positivity, that it could potentially be seen as an expansion of commodification of care, especially in the Westernized nations, right? This is the system that we're in. We commodify everything, right? And then there is the aspect of feminist activism. Now, these are simply the ones that were the most frequent that I heard. I'm sure there are others that are at play, and especially when we get into different cultural contexts, right? Then this whole thing needs to be understood from that perspective as well. So these are just kind of the smattering from kind of my context and my background. But as again, this systems and institutional thinker, I really wanted to try and grasp how end-of-life doulas had emerged within the context of the U.S. society. So that took me way deep into the realm of theory and social movements. So this is a way that I really think that we can understand the rise of end-of-life doulas, and especially to see them not just as individuals, because, right, we have a huge diverse range of people who are interested and involved, but it wasn't just the individuals, and it wasn't even just end-of-life doulas and that specific role, but I wanted to see this in this much broader context. So, social movements, just on the very basic level, right? People coming together to try to change something, culture, society, policy, what have you. Easily in the US, when we think about social movements, we think of civil rights movements, environmental movements, women's rights movements, things like this. So, traditionally, if we're in the theoretical realm, social movements were seen as being about, and so analyzed as one, what we call contentious politics. All right, so this is just politics and law, right? Who's making the law, who has the power to do that? Um, that was really what mattered. How do you influence that power? How do you gain that power? Things to this end. The second major way that they would look at this is resource mobilization, right? Again, this is kind of that capitalistic idea. Those who have the most win. So resources can be time, money, people, right? So the whole idea was, how do you get more of this, right? How do you invest more of these things? But more recently, theoretically, they've developed this new conceptual category of new social movements that are really more about identity, culture, lifestyle. And that was really where I saw end of life doulas kind of fitting into this social movement perspective. So, just kind of briefly, um, I really felt like the rise of end of life doulas was representing, or at least showing, the overlap of three different strands of this new social movement. So, the death reform we're very familiar with, right? This is the reclaiming from the medicalized system. Lifestyle movements was all about showing how personal choices in the ways that we live, or in this case, die, can actually change and reshape society. And then our feminist activism was just highlighting the value um, that the care work that women have done and have historically provided. So, a little more in depth on each one of these, kind of start with our death reform. Right. So we know back in the 60s, 70s, this radical idea developed that we think of as hospice, that people deserved comfort, dignity, and support at end of life. Obviously, this was kind of where a lot of us see the major beginnings of kind of the death reform movement. Definitely caught on. It has grown immensely huge, serves millions of people every year. But at the same time, we've also talked about this, it did become absorbed by the healthcare system, and as a result, became much more bureaucratized, much more medicalized, right? It kind of fell into that pattern. So today's death reform continuation, sometimes we call this death positivity, is still pushing back against that overly medicalized system. Right? It says, let's talk very openly about death. Let's normalize it. Let's humanize it. So, what was the original kind of death reform movement? We see that continuation in things like the death cafes, the green burials, and then, of course, end of life doulas and the work that they're doing, because they're really bringing that conversation about death back into the home, back to families, back to communities. Apologies. This second strand, again, is this lifestyle movements. So the lifestyle movements as a new social movement, category is all about how those personal choices are rippling out, right? Or how your personal choices can reshape culture. Again, kind of within our context, we think of things like veganism, yoga, environmental sustainability, because every one of those represent, right, not just a personal choice that someone's making, but they are statements about their values, about their culture, right? The foundation of those is really all about identity and meaning. So I think end of life doulas were similar by choosing to engage with death and dying differently. right? With presence, with care, with intention. That was reshaping the cultural attitudes and views that we have about death, right? And reminding us that part of living well is dying well, right? That these kind of go hand in hand. And then, of course, our third strand, um, we've mentioned this too as well. Caring for the sick and dying traditionally has been, right, or fallen to women. And very often it is unpaid or underpaid, kind of invisible, unrecognized labor. So, what I was starting to think that I was seeing was that while end-of-life doulas may be continuing this kind of care tradition, of women's care work, they were also pushing back on it by claiming value for this work. But the debate was still open, right? Did claiming value for this work, was that synonymous with monetization, right? And that debate is still open. So, um, whether they professionalize, whether they stay grassroots volunteer, kind of remains to be seen. But this feminist dimension is still recognizable as this is mostly women who are reclaiming and redefining kind of this care at end of life. So, with what I thought, had settled me up ready to do my study, I went forth and I created a survey and sent it out, and I got 234 end-of-life doulas to respond, which I was thrilled about. But it had both combined qualitative and quantitative aspects. So when I say that, right, here's our picture, right? The quantitative, this is the numbers, right? This is all the statistics. But qualitative, this is the storied responses, right? This is that lived experience and the meaning that we're putting behind it. So I wanted to use both of these types to find out, right? Or to try to understand who end-of-life doulas were, why are they doing this work? So the questions I have up here, these were really guiding what I was trying to find out and how I was doing the analysis. So what were the goals and motivations, right? The ambitions of end-of-life doulas, but also how did those align with those three social movement strands that I had identified, right? The death reform, the lifestyle movements, and feminist activism. So quantitatively, right, the numbers, I really wanted to look and try to find out to what extent were the goals shared across this cohort, but then also how did some of the demographic or characteristics of the doulas, so things like age, professional background, caregiving experience, did those impact and change some of these objectives? Now, at the same time, the stories are so important. So I did do some thematic coding of the open-ended responses from participants to try to illuminate what were their personal, but also what are some collective motivations for engaging in this type of work. So I want to start, with giving you the descriptives of the sample, just so that we have the context to place these findings in, because that's really important to understand, right? Who is this information coming from? So, first off, it is primarily a sample of doulas from the US. As expected, many of them, right, majority of them were female, on average, middle age. But then I also took those ages and broke those up into different cohorts that I wanted to look at and see if there were any differences between. Also, as expected, this group is fairly new in its development. About two-thirds of them were identifying or started identifying as an end-of-life doula within the past 3 years. And then also, as expected, there was a mix of practice modes in terms of compensation. So, kind of with that background, kind of understanding who is giving us this information, we go into those goals and motivations. So the first thing I really wanted to find out was, one, do these questions that I've posted here, did they hold together and actually represent the different strands of social movements that I was trying to capture, right? We do this through some fancy statistical work. We call it factor analysis, to try to find out, can we measure some underlying concept that we can't necessarily directly measure? And I was excited to find out, yes, I could. I was even more excited to find out that all three of these strands did hold together as that underlying concept of ambitions and motivations for end-of-life doulas. Now, the other part of this was the table that I've presented here as well. Hmm. Because what they were showing was um, this sample of end-of-life doulas were articulating this multidimensional set of goals, right? So this ranged from enhancing dignity and autonomy to advocating for systemic changes to fostering dialogue, right, around death and dying. So I felt really good that this was evidenced by every one of these potential goals and motivations that were offered to end-of-life doulas. They all got over 50% agreement. So you can see kind of on the right, I have my star at the top for the most agreed upon items, and then it goes all the way down to the least agreed upon items. But those top motivations really were a mix of those overlapping three strands of social movements. You can see helping to achieve a good death and inspiring conversations is really highlighting that death reform movement influence. Being seen as valuable labor, right? Displaying that feminist activism thread. And then empowering others and teaching them and modeling the values that they were hoping to teach. This was all aligned with that lifestyle movement influence. Now, on the other hand, toward the lower end, only about a third were strongly agreeing that they wanted to earn a living as an end-of-life doula. And of course, there was some resistance to the idea of professionalization. So to me, this was kind of indicating that while their recognition of the value of this work was really important, that it really mattered, monetization was not everyone's goal, right? It was just highlighting this idea that it wasn't about the money, it was really about the meaning, but also having that recognized in some way. But, and this is kind of where it becomes even more interesting to me than it already was, that your age and life stage can make a difference when it comes to those two things as a goal. Our younger set or cohorts of doulas, so millennials and Gen Z, were much more likely to see this as potential paid work. Older doulas, so our Gen X and our boomers, much more likely to view it as maybe the calling or a way to volunteer or provide something back. So, one of the things that automatically kind of springs to mind when I hear that is, of course, this makes sense, right? This is the life course perspective. If we're looking at our older doulas, and again, I think Amy had mentioned this, that there may be some other type of financial security, right? Be it retirement, being it a two-income household, something that would allow them to invest more in this, whereas the younger generation of doulas, right, are still in that career phase. They have to be making some sort of income to support themselves. So it made sense to me theoretically why I was seeing some of that difference, but it also was kind of like, the little star that told me the future of this movement could look different depending on how this generational divide kind of shapes up and influences going forward. Now, through the qualitative data, right? These are those kind of storied responses that I got to the question of why did you become an end-of-life doula? I identified six principal ambitions or motivational categories. So one of them was altruistic services to support the dying and their families, right? They just want to help support at end of life. Very often, this was related to a second category of personal legacy or experience around life, right? As I said, many people came to this work much like I did of, I had an experience and I think I can help make that better. I want to help make that better. A third motivation stemmed from what I call socio-emotional or community building influences. So this could be, right, that feeling of being called toward this community, feeling an identification with them, or in some cases, it was simply a desire to very directly and positively influence their direct social network. A third motivation, or I'm sorry, the next one was systems or cultural critiques, which was also related to the fifth category, which was death reform or advocacy to reform some type of policy. So lastly was our motivation for either professional integration and or transition from current health or death care work. So overall, as a researcher, I got very excited to find out that all of this data was really reinforcing the quantitative data that I had already found, and supported the finding that both things are true, right? End-of-life doulas have a diverse set of goals and motivations, and that this diverse set is also a shared set. And that was really fascinating to me. So, big picture findings. Kind of this big takeaway is end-of-life doulas don't fit neatly into the box, right? They don't fit neatly into one conceptual category. They're not just reformers or feminists or lifestyle activists. They're blending all three of these things, right? They mix cultural change, lifestyle choices, and feminist goals. And as we've heard, this can be frustrating because it does make it very hard to define them, but also that flexibility really is kind of the superhero strength, right? It's the power that we're having because they are a social movement it's diffuse, it's flexible, it's evolving. And I really think that that's one of the reasons that it resonates with so many people. So, right, we go back to the big question, why does any of this matter? Because this movement really is highlighting three important things. We are seeing a cultural shift where we're saying we can and we should talk about death openly, right, as a part of life. We are indicating, right, that we have seen death reform in the past. There are still some huge gaps that need to be taken care of, right? That there are needs outside of the institutional setting that really need to be met, that we're lacking. And then, of course, that feminist legacy, right? The invisible labor of care that mostly is done by women, it should be valued. It deserves recognition, even though there's still some questions around how we do this. So, approaching this emergence of end-of-life doulas specifically as a new social movement really helped, at least for me, highlight how they could be seen as this continuation of previous death reform efforts. But even more so, I think it really positioned them within that broader trajectory of healthcare reform because it was really exemplifying for me that hybrid adaptive characteristic of these grassroots movements within healthcare system that are becoming more common. So it's just my argument, right, that end-of-life doulas do represent a broad health-based new social movement that's specifically focused on why death reform needs to happen in multiple ways. So understanding the complexity of their emergence, it's really essential for us to be able to understand them within that continuum of end-of-life care innovations. We have to understand that complexity before we can really start talking about that policy and practice enhancements. So where do we go? I think everyone kind of is in that same realm of understanding, right? It could remain grassroots, mostly volunteer. It could go to the far end of the other spectrum and become fully professionalized and credentialed, but more likely it's going to land somewhere in the middle, right, with recognition and value, but maintaining that flexibility. There's a lot of work to be done. I think cultural context is really one of those that has to start being brought in more to the conversation. But I really see a place where research can help address a ton of this. And I really think it's vital to continue exploring, giving it that depth and that nuance to continue to help this work advance. So if we bring it right all the way back around to the beginning, we know we share death in common. We know that how we die and how we're cared for absolutely can change. And I do think that end-of-life doulas are at the heart of this change, right? Reminding us that dying isn't just the medical event, it is a human experience, and it does deserve space, presence, connection. And I think what I like the most about it is even though they may be working one family at a time, they're not making the change one family at a time, right? They are a part of this movement that's changing how we think about this and changing culture itself. Right, close up. I guess my invitation to you is I hope we continue to collaborate in this type of space, and to develop these robust research areas to advance this field. I hope we continue to support those who make this journey less lonely, right? It's absolutely valued, at least by me, and appreciated. Because in the end, we know, even as a social movement, it's not just a social movement about death. It really is a social movement about how can we live more fully.